If life had a cruel sense of humor, Alexander Grant was convinced he was its favorite punchline. He had just closed a billion-dollar deal, the kind of transaction that financial news anchors drooled over, when his assistant, Melissa, walked into his corner office holding a cream envelope like it was an unexploded bomb. "It's hand-delivered," she said, eyebrows high. "No return address, but, well, it looks fancy." Alexander didn't need to guess. The weight of the paper, the ornate gold calligraphy curling across the front, the faint scent of gardenia, it all pointed to one person. He broke the seal. His eyes skimmed the words, and there it was. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the wedding of Miss Juliette Moreau and Mr. Daniel Hayworth." His ex-fiancée. The woman who had once promised forever and then vanished without warning, breaking their engagement with nothing more than a 3-sentence email. Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, the skyline of Manhattan stretching beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows. "You have got to be kidding me." Melissa shifted awkwardly. "I thought you'd want to know." "Want to know?" His laugh was dry, humorless. "Melissa, she left me for another man and now she's sending me engraved invitations? That's a level of arrogance I almost admire." But he didn't toss it in the trash. Instead, he placed it on his desk, right where the afternoon sunlight caught the gold ink, and let the memory play out in his mind. 2 years ago, Juliette had been the picture of refinement: silky blonde hair, a voice like champagne bubbles, and an ability to charm billionaires, charity boards, and waiters alike. They'd met at a gallery auction, and within 6 months he was convinced she was the woman he'd build his life with. Until one Thursday morning she simply disappeared. No fight, no warning. His calls went unanswered. Then came the email. "Alexander, I'm sorry. I can't explain right now. It's better for both of us. I wish you the best." The better she referred to had turned out to be Daniel Hayworth, an investment banker with the personality of a spreadsheet and a family fortune built on shipping. Alexander had run into them once, accidentally, at the opera. Juliette had looked away, Daniel had smiled like he'd just won something expensive. Now they were inviting him to their wedding. Melissa cleared her throat. "Are you going to go?" "No," Alexander said flatly. But the more he thought about it, the more the word felt hollow. Not going would be the mature thing. The dignified thing. The thing every therapist in Manhattan would advise. But Alexander Grant didn't get to where he was by doing what was dignified. He thrived on making statements, big, bold, unforgettable statements. And suddenly, a wicked idea began to take root. That night, he sat in his penthouse apartment, the city glittering beneath him like a jar of spilled diamonds, and poured himself a glass of scotch. He imagined walking into Juliette's wedding, not alone, but with someone who would make the entire room stop and stare. Someone so unexpected, so out of her perfect little world, that it would rattle the foundation she had built with Daniel. Not another socialite. Not a model. Not a fellow millionaire. No. Someone entirely unpredictable. But where would he find her? The answer came 2 mornings later in the form of spilled coffee. Alexander was at his usual cafe, a small independent spot tucked between a flower shop and a bookstore in Soho, when the door burst open and a woman hurried in, cheeks flushed from the winter wind. She was wearing a mustard yellow scarf and carried an oversized tote bag crammed with sketchbooks. The barista, distracted by Alexander's order, didn't see her reach for a napkin dispenser at the same moment Alexander reached for his coffee. It happened fast. His cup tipped, the liquid arcing through the air and landing squarely across her scarf. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she said, grabbing napkins and dabbing at the stain. Alexander shook his head, half amused. "It's my fault. I should have been paying attention." She looked up then and he noticed 2 things. Her eyes were a rich, deep brown, and she had a presence that made the room feel smaller, more focused. Not because she was loud, she wasn't, but because she seemed real in a way most people he met weren't. "You're Alexander Grant?" she said suddenly. "Guilty. My landlord has your face on a magazine in his office. Some finance thing." She grinned. "Didn't expect you to be a coffee spiller." He found himself smiling back. "I have my flaws." They exchanged names. Hers was Zara Bennett, and talked just long enough for him to learn she was a freelance illustrator who lived 3 subway stops away. She had an easy laugh and no apparent interest in impressing him. And as she turned to leave, something reckless in him said, "Ask her." "Zara," he called out. She paused at the door. This is going to sound insane, but I have a proposition for you. She tilted her head, amused. That's always how trouble starts. I need a date to a wedding. Not just any wedding, my ex-fiancée's wedding. I want someone who can walk in there and not just turn heads but shift the whole atmosphere. Someone unexpected. Her eyebrows shot up. You don't even know me. That's the point. She studied him for a long moment. And why would I agree to something like that? He smiled, the kind of smile that had closed billion-dollar deals. Because I'll make it worth your while. No strings, no weirdness. Just one night of being the most unforgettable woman in the room. Zara's eyes sparkled with mischief. You realize this sounds like the plot of a bad romantic comedy, right? Terrible, he agreed. But with better wardrobe. She laughed, shaking her head. You're serious, aren't you? Deadly. There was a pause, long enough for him to wonder if he'd crossed a line. Then she said, all right. But if I do this, we do it my way. Deal. Alexander didn't know what her way meant yet. But as she walked out of the cafe, scarf still damp from the coffee, he had a feeling this was about to be far more than a simple statement at a wedding. He had no idea just how right he was. Zara Bennett had a rule: never agree to anything that sounded like it belonged in a Netflix rom-com. And yet, here she was, sitting across from Alexander Grant in the back corner of the same cafe where he'd drenched her scarf with coffee 2 days earlier, listening to him pitch the most absurd idea she'd heard all year. So let me get this straight, she said, stirring her tea slowly. You want me, someone you met by accident, someone you know nothing about, to go to your ex-fiancée's wedding, as your date? Alexander nodded, completely serious. Correct. And you think this will, what? Make her jealous? Humiliate her? Start an elaborate social war in the middle of a wedding reception? That's a dramatic way of putting it, he said, but his mouth twitched. I just want to make a statement. The kind people remember. Zara leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. And you're not worried about the fact that I could be a total psychopath? I'm willing to take that risk. Truth was, Zara found the whole thing oddly entertaining. It wasn't every day that a billionaire strolled into her life asking for a +1 gig that sounded like it belonged in a gossip column. She was a freelance illustrator who lived in a third-floor walk-up with leaky pipes and a view of a brick wall. Most days her life was deadlines, coffee runs, and negotiating late payments from clients who thought creative work meant free work. And here sat Alexander Grant, tailored suit, watch worth more than her annual rent, eyes that studied people like they were chess pieces, asking her to be the grenade he planned to toss into his ex's big day. If nothing else, it would make for a hell of a story. All right, Zara said finally. I'll do it. But we need ground rules. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Ground rules? Yes. Rule 1, I am not your girlfriend. Don't act like I am. I'm playing a role and I'll play it convincingly, but I'm not here to be arm candy. Understood. Rule 2, I pick what I wear. No stylist you hire is going to turn me into some step-forward version of myself. Fine, he said, though she caught the flicker of intrigue in his expression. And Rule 3, I'm allowed to have fun with this. Alexander leaned forward. Define fun. Zara grinned, slow and deliberate. You'll see. They shook on it, and she expected that to be the end of the conversation. But Alexander wasn't the kind of man who operated halfway. By the next afternoon, a black town car pulled up outside her apartment. The driver handed her an embossed envelope. Inside was the wedding invitation, along with a note in neat, slanted handwriting. Zara, consider this your mission dossier. We'll make them remember you. She laughed out loud, then immediately stopped laughing when she saw the venue printed on the card. The Astoria Grand Hotel, one of the most exclusive spaces in New York, where chandeliers were imported from Italy and champagne was served in crystal flutes that probably cost more than her laptop. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a statement in itself. The following week was a strange blur. Alexander insisted on a rehearsal dinner of sorts, just the two of them at an upscale steakhouse, so they could practice their cover story. We met in Soho, he began. True, Zara said. At an art gallery, he continued. False, she corrected. We met because you spilled coffee on me. That's the story we tell. It's real, it's funny, and it'll make you seem human instead of whatever you usually seem like. He chuckled. And what do I usually seem like? A man who uses words like synergy without irony. Fair, he admitted. They went over names, dates, tiny details about their supposed relationship. Zara asked questions he didn't expect. What was the first movie we watched together? He blinked. I don't know. Casablanca? No, she said firmly. It was Spider-Man, Into the Spider-Verse, because it's awesome and makes us look cooler than we are. He scribbled it down, obedient. Zara had a knack for this. She wasn't just agreeing to attend, she was scripting a whole narrative, one that would feel natural to anyone listening. Alexander found himself oddly impressed. The night before the wedding, Zara stood in front of her mirror, holding up two dresses. One was a sleek black gown, safe, elegant, forgettable. The other was a bold, floor-length number in deep emerald, the kind of color that turned heads under ballroom lighting. She smiled, setting the black one aside. If Alexander wanted a statement, she'd give him one. The morning of the wedding, Alexander arrived at her building in a chauffeured Bentley. He stepped out wearing a midnight blue tuxedo, sharp enough to cut glass. For a moment, Zara wondered if she was in over her head. You look, he began, then stopped. She twirled once, letting the emerald fabric flare around her. Different from your usual crowd? Better, he said simply, offering his arm. As they slid into the back of the car, Zara pulled out her phone. One last thing, she said, typing quickly. What's that? Just letting my group chat know I'm about to crash the fanciest wedding in New York with a billionaire I barely know. They want pictures. Alexander shook his head, but there was a hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. You really are going to enjoy this, aren't you? You have no idea, Zara said. And as the car pulled away from the curb, she leaned back against the leather seat, already imagining the look on Juliette Moreau's face when she saw them walk in together. It was going to be delicious. The Astoria Grand Hotel's ballroom glittered like a jeweled treasure chest, golden chandeliers spilling light onto marble floors, a string quartet playing something so delicate it almost dissolved in the air. The guests, swathed in couture and diamonds, moved in practiced circles of polite laughter and strategic air kissing. The double doors swung open. In walked Alexander Grant. He was a man people noticed, broad-shouldered, perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo, the quiet confidence of someone who knew the price of everything in the room and could buy it twice. But it wasn't Alexander who froze the room. It was the woman on his arm. Zara Bennett, in her deep emerald gown, moved like she owned the floor. The rich color clung to her in all the right places, the train whispering behind her with every step. A gold cuff gleamed on her wrist, a bold contrast against her smooth brown skin. She wore no necklace, letting the sweep of her collarbone and the tilt of her chin do the talking. Her hair was styled in soft curls that framed her face, and her expression was pure, unapologetic self-possession. She looked like she belonged, no, like she chose to be there, which was far rarer. The whispers started immediately. Who is she? She's not from his usual circle. Where's Juliette? Has she seen them yet? Alexander's grip on her arm was relaxed, but Zara could feel the faint tension in his muscles. This was his arena, but tonight she was the weapon. Smile, she murmured without looking at him. I am smiling, he replied. Not with your mouth, with your ego. You want them to wonder. He glanced sideways at her, and for a flicker of a second, something like admiration passed through his eyes. The first ambush came near the champagne table. A tall man with slicked back hair and a gold cufflink habit stepped forward, grinning like they were old friends. Alexander, didn't expect to see you here. And his gaze slid to Zara, curious and calculating. You've brought company. This is Zara Bennett, Alexander said smoothly. Zara, this is Charles Ellison. We went to Harvard together. Lovely to meet you, Charles said, his tone betraying his need to place her in his mental Rolodex of people who mattered. Zara extended her hand, her smile warm but edged with mystery. Likewise. She didn't elaborate, and the silence stretched just long enough for Charles to fumble for his glass and retreat. They moved deeper into the ballroom. Every few steps, Zara caught snippets of conversation. Never seen her before. Not his type at all. God, she's gorgeous. And then, like a change in the weather, Zara felt the attention shift. She didn't have to turn to know why. Juliette Moreau had entered the room. Juliette was every bit the Vision Society pages adored. Slim, graceful, her champagne-colored gown catching the light with each step. Her blonde hair was swept into an intricate twist, and her smile was the carefully polished kind you could hang in a museum. But when her gaze landed on Alexander and the woman beside him, the smile faltered. Only for a second. But Zara caught it. Juliet approached her fiancé Daniel Hayworth in tow. Daniel's handshake with Alexander was firm but cold. "Alexander," Juliet said, her voice smooth as silk. "I'm so glad you could make it." "You did send me an invitation," Alexander replied. "I'd have hated to disappoint." Juliet's eyes flicked to Zara. "And who's this?" "This is Zara," Alexander said. "My date." Zara extended her hand. "Congratulations. This place is stunning." Juliet took the hand, her smile sharpening just enough to draw blood. "Thank you. We spared no expense." Zara's own smile didn't waver. "Oh, I can tell." The quartet struck a higher note, and Daniel steered Juliet away under the guise of greeting other guests. But Zara didn't miss the backward glance Juliet threw at them. "Was that the reaction you wanted?" Zara asked as they walked toward the bar. "Almost," Alexander said. "I think she's still deciding whether you're a threat or a puzzle." Zara sipped her champagne. "Good. Let's make sure she never figures it out." By the time dinner was called, they'd made the rounds. Zara listening more than she spoke, answering questions with just enough detail to seem intriguing while leaving the rest to imagination. The whispers hadn't stopped. And as they took their seats at the long, glittering table, Zara leaned toward Alexander and said, "I think the room's exactly where you want it, off balance." He gave her a look that was equal parts approval and curiosity. "You're enjoying this?" "Immensely." What neither of them realized was that Zara's real performance hadn't even started yet. That would come later, during the toast. Juliette Moreau had perfected the art of smiling through discomfort. It was a skill honed over years of black-tie galas, charity luncheons, and the kind of society dinners where one wrong glance could ripple through gossip columns for weeks. But as she watched Alexander Grant and the mysterious woman in emerald glide into her wedding, Juliet felt her well-trained mask strain at the edges. She wasn't prepared for how good they looked together. Alexander, always composed, always infuriatingly sure of himself, stood taller, sharper, more dangerous than she remembered. And the woman beside him. Juliet's first thought was that she was stunning. Her second thought was that she didn't belong here. Not in this world, not in this ballroom. The gown was exquisite, yes, but the way she wore it, confident, almost challenging, made it impossible to look anywhere else. And that skin, glowing under the chandelier light, the curve of her lips when she smiled at a passing waiter, it was the kind of beauty that made Juliet's carefully cultivated elegance feel almost clinical. When they finally crossed paths, Juliet told herself she'd keep it civil. She greeted Alexander first, giving Daniel's hand a subtle squeeze to remind herself she wasn't here to wage war. But then the woman spoke. "Congratulations. This place is stunning." The voice was smooth, unhurried, warm in a way that made Juliet's stomach tighten. There was no awkwardness, no attempt to impress, just a calm, grounded presence. Juliet had spent years mastering the kind of femininity that made men protective and women competitive. But this was different. This woman wasn't competing at all. And somehow that made her more dangerous. Dinner only made it worse. Juliet was seated 2 places away from Alexander and the woman, Zara, he'd called her. She'd overheard just enough of their conversation to notice the way Zara laughed at his driest jokes, how Alexander's eyes softened when she spoke. It was infuriating. Alexander had brought women to events before, even when they were together. Always models, socialites, or the occasional art curator with an impeccable resume. They blended into the background, accessories to his presence. Zara was no accessory. She was a spotlight in human form. Juliet tried to focus on her guests, on Daniel, on the fact that this day was about her. But her gaze kept flicking back, and every time, she caught Zara looking effortlessly composed, as if she were exactly where she belonged. It didn't help that the room had shifted around them. People leaned in when Zara spoke. Men asked her questions with real interest. Women studied her, trying to place her, trying to find the seam in the image that would explain why Alexander Grant had chosen her. No one seemed to find it. By the time the main course was cleared, Juliet's patience was wearing thin. She excused herself from the table under the pretense of speaking with the maitre d'. In truth, she needed air and space from whatever game Alexander was playing. Out in the corridor, she steadied herself. Why should she care? She was marrying Daniel, a man who loved her, who gave her stability, who understood the world they moved in. Alexander was part of the past, a chapter closed. And yet, the way he looked at Zara, it wasn't the gaze of a man making a petty statement. It was curiosity, maybe even admiration. That unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. When she returned to the ballroom, the string quartet had transitioned to a soft waltz. The dance floor was filling, but her eyes went straight to the center. Alexander and Zara were dancing. They weren't pressed close, this wasn't scandal, but the way they moved together, it was easy, fluid, as if they'd done this 100 times. Zara's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, her gown sweeping around her in a way that made every turn look choreographed. Juliet's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. She felt Daniel's hand touch her elbow. "You okay?" he murmured. "Of course," she said, smiling the smile she'd been perfecting since she was 17. But the truth was she wasn't. Because for the first time that night, Juliet realized she might not be the most captivating woman in the room. And she hated that feeling more than she'd hated anything in years. She told herself it didn't matter. That Zara would be gone after tonight, just another fleeting name in Alexander's long list of beautiful distractions. But a part of her, small and sharp, couldn't shake the suspicion that this woman wasn't fleeting at all. And that terrified her. The champagne had been poured. The guests had quieted. The time for toasts had arrived. Juliet's maid of honor stood first, delivering a glowing tribute filled with inside jokes and teary-eyed well wishes. Daniel's best man followed, tossing in just enough humor to keep the mood light before ending with a sentimental punch that had half the table sighing. Juliet rose next, her champagne flute poised like a wand, thanking everyone for coming and lavishing praise on her new husband. It was poised, polished, exactly what everyone expected from her. Then she sat. And for a moment, it seemed the formalities were over. Until Zara stood up. It wasn't dramatic, no chair scraping, no theatrical clearing of the throat. She simply rose, emerald gown catching the light, and lifted her glass. "Since I'm apparently the only one here tonight who doesn't know the bride and groom personally," she began, "I thought I'd offer the unique perspective of a complete outsider." The room stirred. Curious. Amused. Juliet's head tilted just slightly, the polite smile on her face straining. Alexander said nothing, but his eyes followed Zara closely. "I met Alexander," she glanced down at him with a small smile, "in a way most people would call accidental. You spilled coffee on me. Twice. I should have taken it as a warning sign." Light laughter rippled through the tables. "But here's what I've learned since then. Sometimes the people who stumble into your life, literally, can show you something you didn't know you needed to see. And tonight, I think that's what weddings are supposed to remind us of." A few guests leaned forward. This wasn't the awkward date speech they'd expected. "Now, I don't know Juliet or Daniel," Zara continued, her tone still warm. "But I do know what it's like to watch someone you care about choose a different path. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it makes sense later. And sometimes..." Her gaze swept the room, catching Juliet's eyes for a fraction of a second. "It teaches you exactly who you are and exactly what you won't settle for." The air shifted. People stopped fiddling with cutlery. Even the quartet in the corner seemed to play more softly. "I also know," she said, smiling faintly, "that the real mark of love isn't how perfect it looks tonight. It's what happens when the music stops, when the guests go home, and it's just the two of you in the quiet. If you can still look at each other then and laugh and choose each other again, then you've won." She raised her glass slightly. "So here's to the moments that test us, the choices that define us, and the courage to stand exactly where you want to be, no matter who's watching." It should have ended there. But Zara wasn't quite finished. She lowered her glass, her eyes locking on Juliet's once more. "And here's to unexpected company. The kind that walks into a room and reminds everyone that sometimes, life doesn't follow the guest list." A murmur swept through the tables. Zara sipped her champagne, set the flute down, and sat. Alexander didn't move for a moment. His jaw was set, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of admiration, maybe even pride. Juliet's smile stayed in place, but the tension in her shoulders was visible to anyone watching closely. Daniel glanced at her, clearly puzzled, but she didn't look back. The applause came in a scattered wave, hesitant at first, then building as more guests joined in. Not loud enough to be raucous, but enough to make the moment undeniable. Alexander leaned toward Zara, his voice low. You just hijacked the evening. Not at all, she said, still smiling. I just redirected it. He studied her for a long second, as though trying to decide whether she was brilliant or dangerous. Both, he murmured. For the rest of the evening, Zara didn't need to move from her seat to command attention. Guests approached her table, curious, drawn in by the mystery. Juliet never approached her again. But every time Zara caught her across the room, she saw the same thing in Juliet's eyes: wariness. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of regret. What neither woman realized was that the real fallout from Zara's toast was still hours away, once the whispers turned into phone calls and phone calls turned into headlines. But for now, the ballroom hummed with the unshakable feeling that something had just shifted, and that the bride's perfect night no longer belonged entirely to her. Zara, for her part, seemed perfectly at ease. She sipped champagne, traded quips with Alexander, and acted as though she hadn't just shifted the entire energy of the room. But she felt the weight of eyes on her, some curious, some suspicious. She noticed one gaze in particular, Daniel Hayworth's. It had been there all night, flickering toward her when he thought no one was looking. At first, she assumed it was simple curiosity, wondering who she was, why she was here with Alexander. But now, after her toast, that look had changed. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was recognition. He approached during a lull in the dancing, Juliet distracted by a circle of guests near the bar. Zara Bennett, he said, his voice low enough not to carry. Didn't think I'd ever see you again. Zara's smile didn't falter, but her grip tightened on her glass. You're mistaken. Daniel's eyes narrowed. No, I'm not. It's been, what, 5 years? Philadelphia. A mural project on 7th Street. You were. She cut him off, her tone suddenly sharper. I was a college student trying to pay my rent. And you were a man who thought a small art commission gave you license to. Her voice stopped dead, but her eyes told the rest. Alexander, still at their table, noticed the tension immediately and stood, moving to her side with a casual grace that didn't fool anyone paying attention. Everything all right here? He asked, his voice polite but edged. Daniel stepped back half an inch, his smile returning like a mask. Of course. Just catching up with an old acquaintance. Not that old, Zara said coolly. Some things you remember forever. Juliet's voice cut across the tension. Daniel, darling, come help me with the gift list. She'd reappeared, and though her tone was light, her eyes flicked between Zara and Alexander with razor-sharp calculation. Daniel excused himself without another word. Alexander waited until they were alone before speaking. Want to tell me what that was? Zara's gaze stayed on the dance floor. Your ex-fiancée's new husband hired me once. Paid me half of what he promised, then tried to make it up in other ways. I told him where to shove it. Alexander's jaw tightened. And he recognized you tonight. Oh, he recognized me the second I walked in, she said. Your ex probably has no idea. Or maybe she does and decided to ignore it. Alexander glanced toward Daniel, now laughing with Juliet as though nothing had happened. Why didn't you tell me before? Zara met his eyes then, steady and unapologetic. Because this was your show. I wasn't planning to steal the spotlight. But I guess the truth doesn't like staying in the wings. The rest of the night moved in fragments. Alexander fielding questions from curious guests, Zara dodging conversations that probed too deep, Juliet shooting glances that were equal parts suspicion and unease. By the time the final dance was announced, the ballroom felt smaller, the air thicker. When the bride and groom made their grand exit, applause ringing out, Zara stayed seated. She clapped politely, but her eyes stayed on Daniel until the doors closed behind him. In the car afterward, Alexander finally broke the silence. That toast you gave, was that aimed at her? Or at him? Both, Zara said without hesitation. She needed to be reminded she's not untouchable. And he needed to remember that the past has a way of showing up when you least expect it. Alexander leaned back, watching the city lights blur past the tinted glass. You realize you may have just turned the gossip cycle upside down for the next month. Zara smirked. Good. Let them talk. Just make sure they spell my name right. Neither of them knew it yet, but by morning, someone would leak the story, complete with photos of Zara in her emerald gown, her name, and the murmur of a scandal involving the groom. And when that happened, the wedding wouldn't be remembered for its chandeliers or its champagne. It would be remembered for the moment a stranger walked in and cracked the perfect facade. Alexander Grant wasn't a man who believed in fate. Deals were made by leverage, not destiny. Success was built on strategy, not luck. People didn't just walk into your life at the exact right moment, they were put there by design or they weren't there at all. At least, that's what he'd believed until Zara Bennett. From the moment she'd stepped into that cafe, scarf bright against the gray of winter, she'd been a disruption. And not the kind you ignored. She was unexpected. Most women in his world played by an unspoken set of rules, polished, predictable, and careful about what they said in front of someone like him. Zara didn't seem to know those rules existed, or maybe she just didn't care. That alone made her dangerous. The wedding had been meant as a move in a private chess game between him and Juliet, a silent message delivered with a smile. But somewhere between the champagne table and that toast, the board had shifted. Zara hadn't just played along. She'd taken control. And she'd done it without asking his permission. He thought about the way she'd stood, glass in hand, commanding a room full of people who had no reason to listen to her, and making them listen anyway. She hadn't postured, hadn't fawned. She'd simply spoken as though the moment belonged to her. In that instant he'd realized she wasn't his pawn. She wasn't even his queen. She was her own player entirely. Back in the car after the wedding, the city moving in streaks of gold and shadow outside the tinted windows, Alexander found himself watching her. Not in the casual, assessing way he usually observed people, but with a kind of unguarded curiosity that felt foreign. She was scrolling through her phone, smirking at a text, hair falling loose over one shoulder. She didn't seem the least bit fazed by the fact that she'd just rattled half of New York's elite. "You don't look like someone who just appended a wedding," he said. Zara glanced up, one eyebrow lifting. "And you don't look like someone who just got exactly what he wanted." That made him smile. "I didn't get exactly what I wanted." She tilted her head. "Then what did you want?" He didn't answer right away. The truth was complicated. Originally what he'd wanted was simple. Juliet to see him happy, thriving, untouchable. But after tonight, maybe I wanted to see what would happen if I let someone else take the lead, he admitted. Her smirk softened into something almost like surprise. "And how's that working out for you?" He looked straight at her. "Dangerously well." When they reached her apartment, Alexander expected her to linger, to bask in the afterglow of their small victory. Instead, she gathered her things without ceremony. "Well," she said, "it's been fun, Grant. Try not to get into too much trouble without me." He frowned slightly. "That's it? No drink to celebrate?" "Celebrations are for endings," she said, stepping out of the car. "This feels more like a beginning. And beginnings are better left unfinished for a while." Then she was gone, the emerald gown vanishing up the steps, the sound of her heels fading until the street swallowed her. Alexander stayed in the car for a long moment after she disappeared, the driver waiting silently. A beginning. The thought lingered, curling into something he couldn't quite name. He wasn't used to people walking away from him first. He wasn't used to not being in control of what happened next. And he definitely wasn't used to wanting to chase after them. By morning, the headlines confirmed what he'd suspected would happen. Mystery woman steals the show at society wedding. Who is Zara Bennett? Groom's past connection raises questions. There were grainy cell phone photos of Zara's toast, videos of her dancing with him, even close-ups of Juliet's face when she first saw them. Alexander scrolled through the coverage, his expression unreadable. This was supposed to be a small, personal strike. Instead, it had become a spectacle. And yet, he didn't mind. For the first time in years, he wasn't just playing the game, he was curious about where it might go. And all because a stranger with a mustard yellow scarf and a fearless smile had decided to say yes. By noon the next day, Zara's phone was vibrating so much she stuffed it into the couch cushions just to get a moment of peace. She'd ignored 5 calls from an unlisted number, 7 from friends, and 1 from her aunt in Georgia who never called unless it was either someone's birthday or the end of the world. Judging by her aunt's frantic voicemail, "Baby, you on the news? Call me back right now before I have a heart attack." This was apparently the latter. The story had spread like fire in a dry field. Mystery woman wows at high-profile wedding. Alexander Grant's stunning date raises eyebrows. Who is she? A closer look at the woman who stole the night. The articles were relentless. Some were flattering, calling her effortlessly magnetic. Others were Less so, implying she was some kind of gold digger who'd snagged a billionaire for the night. The worst part? They weren't just speculating about her, they were digging. Old photos from her college art shows. Blog posts she'd written years ago. Even a blurry shot of her working at a coffee shop, pulled from someone's ancient Instagram. She wasn't used to being watched and she didn't like how exposed it made her feel. By early afternoon she gave in and called Alexander. "Tell me this dies down by tomorrow," she said without preamble. On the other end he chuckled. "Zara, if I had that kind of control over the media, I wouldn't be spending half my life dodging them." "I'm serious, Grant. I didn't sign up to have my whole life splashed across headlines. You signed up to come to a wedding with me. The rest was collateral." "Collateral?" she repeated, incredulous. "That makes me sound like property damage." He laughed again, softer this time. "I didn't mean it that way. Look, the easiest thing is to get ahead of it. Do one interview. Control the narrative before they do it for you." "No," she said immediately. "I'm not some PR prop for you to spin." "Then what's your plan? Hide in your apartment until they get bored?" "Exactly." That night, a black town car pulled up outside her building anyway. She told herself not to answer when the buzzer rang, but Alexander's voice came through the speaker, and it was the kind of voice that didn't sound like it accepted the word no. "You have 5 minutes to come down," he said, "or I'm coming up. And I've been told my brand of persistence is bad for neighborly relations." She groaned, but she came down. He was leaning against the car when she stepped outside, dressed in the kind of casual suit that cost more than her monthly rent. "Get in," he said, opening the door. She crossed her arms. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere we can talk without 3 different photographers hiding in the bushes." They ended up in a private booth at a rooftop bar, the city stretching out below them in glittering lines. Zara kept her coat on, as if ready to leave at any moment. Alexander slid a tablet across the table. On it were half a dozen headlines, each paired with a draft press statement. "You wrote statements about me without even asking me," she said. "I wrote options. You don't have to use them. But if you do, it turns this from a scandal into a story. And in this city, the difference between the two is everything." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why do you care so much about how this plays out? You got what you wanted already, you made Juliet jealous, rattled her groom. It's not just about them anymore," he said quietly. That stopped her. "Then what is it about?" He leaned forward, his gaze steady in a way that made her pulse skip. "It's about the fact that I don't like the idea of you being torn apart by people who've never even met you. And maybe I like the idea of keeping you around a little longer." Her stomach did something inconveniently warm. She looked away first. "You're impossible." "Possibly," he said with a smile. "But so are you." When she left the bar that night, Zara still hadn't agreed to the press statement. But she also didn't block his number. And Alexander, watching her disappear into the elevator, knew one thing for certain. Whatever game they were playing now, it had nothing to do with weddings anymore. The invitation arrived the next afternoon, hand-delivered by a courier in a sharp gray suit. Zara almost didn't open it. Anything coming from Alexander Grant had strings attached, usually silk strings tied in complicated knots. But curiosity won. Inside was a cream card embossed in gold. Private dinner, 7:30 p.m. Grant Tower, 52nd floor. Dress, elegant. No explanation. No reason given. Just a place, a time, and the kind of implied be there that made saying no feel impossible. She spent too long deciding what to wear. Not because she cared about impressing him, at least that's what she told herself, but because she didn't want to show up looking like she'd stumbled into something she couldn't handle. The dress she chose was midnight blue, the fabric clinging in a way that felt like armor disguised as elegance. When she stepped into Grant Tower's private elevator, she felt the first stir of nerves. This was no wedding crowd she could charm with a quick wit and a glass of champagne. This was his world, polished, closed, and filled with people who looked at strangers like they were uninvited guests. The elevator opened directly into the dining space. Glass walls framed the skyline, and the long table glittered with crystal and silver. A private chef worked silently at a marble counter in the corner. But what caught her off guard wasn't the view or the opulence. It was that there were only 2 place settings. Alexander was already there, leaning back in his chair with the kind of lazy confidence that came from knowing everything in the room belonged to him. You came, he said. You didn't give me much of a choice, she replied, slipping into the seat opposite him. What's this about? Some charity thing? Another PR stunt? No, he said, pouring wine into her glass. This one's for me. For you, she repeated. You rented out your own building for a dinner with one person? He smiled faintly. I own the building. And it's not about the building. It's about perspective. Dinner began with seared scallops, followed by roast duck with figs. The chef moved like a shadow, silent and efficient. At first, Zara kept the conversation light, safe topics like travel, food, and the ridiculousness of celebrity gossip. But Alexander didn't let it stay there. He asked about her art, about why she'd stopped showing her work, about the kind of questions that made her want to retreat behind a joke. But something in his expression made her answer instead. I got tired of putting myself out there, she admitted. The rejection's loud. The praise is quiet. After a while, the noise wins. He studied her. You're not afraid of noise. You're afraid of not being heard through it. The words landed harder than she expected. Halfway through dessert, a dark chocolate torte that should have been the most indulgent part of the night, he surprised her again. I want to hire you, he said. She blinked. As what? Your fake date? Your scandal shield? He shook his head. As a consultant. For a gallery I'm opening. I've got the money and the space but not the eye. You've got both. Zara leaned back, unsure whether to laugh or accuse him of making this up just to keep her around. You're serious? Dead serious, he said. Think about it. You get to curate something on your terms. And maybe you stop hiding from the noise. For a moment she forgot about the wine, the view, even the man in front of her. She thought about light-filled rooms and canvases that didn't gather dust in storage. She thought about having a reason to create again. And then she remembered, Alexander Grant never did anything without a reason. What's in it for you? She asked. He didn't flinch. I get to see what you do when the world's actually watching. By the time she left, the city stretched out below like a constellation she could almost touch. She wasn't sure if she'd just been offered an opportunity, or if she'd stepped into a trap. Maybe both. And maybe that was why she couldn't stop smiling on the elevator ride down. The morning sunlight spilled through Zara's curtains, catching on the gold-trimmed envelope lying on her coffee table. It had been there all night, unopened. She knew who it was from. She also knew that if she opened it, she'd have to make a choice, one that would change how this whole whirlwind story ended. When she finally broke the seal, the note inside was simple, written in Alexander's elegant, impatient scrawl. Zara. Dinner tonight. No press, no games. I have something to tell you. She almost didn't go. After all, what were they really? A dare turned into a spectacle turned into whatever this was. But curiosity, and maybe something softer, won out. Grant Tower's 52nd floor was empty except for a table set for two, candles flickering against the city skyline. Alexander stood at the far end, hands in his pockets, looking for once like a man who didn't have everything under control. You're late, he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. I wasn't sure I was coming, she replied. I wasn't sure you would, he admitted. Dinner was quiet at first. No reporters. No wedding guests. No games to play. Just the scrape of silverware and the hum of the city far below. Finally, Alexander set down his glass. Do you know what people have been calling you in the press? Plenty of things. Most of them unprintable. He smiled faintly. The one I like best is the wild card. Because you walked into a room where you were supposed to be invisible, and instead, you owned it. You made me forget why I brought you there in the first place. She tilted her head. And why did you bring me there? To make my ex jealous, he said plainly. But that's not why I asked you to stay. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Zara's heart was doing a strange, unhelpful thing in her chest. Then why did you? She asked softly. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze steady. Because you're the only person who hasn't tried to be what I wanted. You've just been. And that's a lot harder to find than you think. Zara laughed, but there was no bite to it. You know I'm not built for your world, right? The tabloids, the champagne wars, the polished lies. I don't need you to be, he said. I just need you to keep being the one person who calls me on mine. She stared at him for a long time, trying to decide if this was just another carefully constructed pitch. But his eyes didn't have that glint of calculation tonight. They looked open. And maybe, just maybe, she'd been waiting for someone to look at her like that. When dessert came, she pushed her plate aside. "All right," she said. "I'll take the job." His brows lifted. "The gallery?" "Yes. But not because of you. Because I want it." His mouth curved into a slow smile. "Fair enough." "And," she added, "we're not doing this whole date for the cameras thing anymore. If anyone asks what we are, you tell them." "I'll tell them the truth," he interrupted. "That you're the one person who ever surprised me." They finished dinner without rushing, the easy silence between them speaking louder than the clinking glasses ever could. When she left, Alexander walked her to the elevator. As the door slid shut, he said, "Zara?" She looked up. "I'm glad you crashed my wedding plans." She grinned. "I'm glad I shocked everyone." The headlines the next day weren't about the ex-fiancée anymore. They were about the wild card. The woman who had stepped into a millionaire's world, turned it upside down, and walked away with exactly what she wanted. And for once, Zara didn't mind the noise. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the smallest steps lead to the biggest changes. Subscribe and join us for more stories that prove compassion can change the world.